All right, so one of the things that students often struggle most with in senior seminar is how to organize their ideas. So the next 2 weeks we're going to be working on this worksheet that I hope will help you figure out how to organize the ideas that you've had and that you've read in order to get a well-organized paper. So your paper is a literature review. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through this worksheet that is what I assigned you for your homework. So your paper is a literature review that describes or evaluates or synthesizes past research. What your paper should do is show that you've read and understood the topic and show that you can use other people's arguments to support your own idea. So it's kind of broken down into 5 steps. Now, the steps are generally carried out in this order, but the process isn't a linear one. So it's okay if you start reading articles and realize you need to revise your thesis or you're missing information on a certain topic and you need to go back and look for more information. That's what I would expect to happen. So please continue to look for sources. Feel free to go back to EBSCO and start that process again, or to throw out articles if you decide they're not relevant. So the first step is gathering your sources. So by this point, you should have finished gathering relevant literature on your topic. And hopefully you should have read your sources. If you haven't done this yet, you should finish reading your sources before you move on to the next step. And so we talked about this last week, but while you read your sources, you want to interact with them as you go. And after you've read a couple, you should really start thinking about what are the differences between the sources, how might you categorize or organize them. Sometimes printing and using hard copies to kind of help you sort things might make things easier, but we talked about using an Excel file or any kind of digital notes. You can actually color code them and use that in a similar way. Next is to determine common themes. This is often where students struggle, but this is really important because this will help you organize your literature review into sections. With a 15 to 20 page paper, you're going to need multiple sections. So you need to figure out, you've read 10, 15 articles, how can you organize them in a way that makes sense? And it's important to know, and we'll come back to this in the next part of this paper, but you might use a paper in more than one spot. So I say organize articles, but really I mean organize the information within articles. So these are a couple of ways that you might think about organizing the information that you're getting. One very common one is subtopic. Okay, so are there issues of different schools of thought or race or socioeconomic status or age that might influence your topic? So for example, if you're studying PTSD and memory, you might have some articles that talk about short-term memory and others that focus on long-term memory, and so those might be different sections of your paper. Chronology is another one. So maybe historically or chronologically you might organize your topic. In psychology papers, often age is a big one, right? So if you're talking about the influence of ADHD, you might find some articles that talk about childhood, some that talk about adolescence, and some that talk about adulthood, and you might think about organizing your paper by age. Methodology, so do some papers use different methods than others, and how do they compare? You might also be thinking about certain strengths or weaknesses in your paper. Different fields of study, if you've picked something that's kind of cross-disciplinary, you might have some clinical papers and also some educational psychology papers on ADHD, and they might kind of address it from a different perspective. Different demographics is another common one. So can you group information by the population that they're studying? So either age, we talked about that already, but income, maybe we find different effects for high versus low SES or education or other things like that. Different conclusions or findings. There might be some studies that find that your intervention that you're studying is good, and others find it's not effective. And so you might group them that way. And also geography, if they've been focused in certain areas. So when you've read the material carefully, you should be able to identify some themes that you pick up. Your themes are not limited to the ones listed here, but these are just some ways that you might think about categorizing the information. And when you categorize this information, you're really categorizing your paper as well, and figuring out what are the subsections of your paper going to be. So once you've identified some themes in your sources, you can use this chart to help you organize the content of your literature review. So your assignment for this week is to really take some time to fill in this table below. And so I want you to think about kind of identify some common themes and think about how each of your sources addresses or mentions a specific theme. Typically, you'd fill out the horizontal rows first, kind of go source by source and identify the themes. And then you might move to, so identify your specific sources, and then you'd move to each column and write about how each of your sources addresses one of your themes. So, for example, and just note that you don't have to fill in all boxes. So each source doesn't have to address each one of your themes, but there should be some overlap. So for example, let's say I'm looking at the influence of classroom climate, so how teachers teach, on peer relationships. Okay, and I notice that some of my studies talk about positive relationships like acceptance and friendship. Other studies talk about victimization, and other studies talk about exclusion. And so, this might be a common theme that, hey, maybe I can organize based on the different type of peer relationship, and this might be a way to organize my paper. So I would list those three themes of positive peer relations, victimization, and exclusion. My first paper might only talk about friendship. So I'd fill in the first block here. I don't think it'll let me highlight, but there you go. I'd fill in my first block there and say, my first source, Smith and colleague, just talked about friendship. A second source, though, might talk about teachers and how they influence friendship and exclusion. So here I might make a point, identify what they say about friendship and what they say about exclusion. Here, it would be helpful if I fill this in. And victimization and exclusion. So this is Smith. Here's what they say. Teachers influence friendship. Source 2 is Collins, and you'd want to put the full APA citation there. And Collins, let's say, found that teachers promote positive engagement. Teachers don't influence victimization. Okay, so you're putting kind of the pieces that are relevant. Maybe source 3, Muns et al. Talked about only the negative things and found that teachers actually don't influence victimization or exclusion. Now, obviously, these aren't real articles, and I'm just making this up, but what I want you to see is that certain articles, each article may address more than one theme or topic you're covering, but most articles won't address all of them. And so your goal here is to really use this, and you should be adding more. Ideally, you'd use all of your sources because this is going to help you make your outline to really figure out what are the themes that you're going to identify or cover in your paper, and how do each one of your sources address it. Each source does not have to fit just neatly into one. It can overlap. They don't have to find the same effects. But the goal here is to really help you figure out, what are the common findings? What are the uncommon findings? Are there discrepancy between the articles? And you might realize, you had planned to talk about friendship, victimization, exclusion. You've got a ton of stuff on friendship, a ton of stuff on victimization, and oh wait, this Mullins article is the only one you have on exclusion. So then you might need to go back and say, okay, I need to do some more research to find articles explicitly on exclusion, or maybe I want to cut it and focus on something else. So this is the goal of this table and this exercise, is to help you really figure out, okay, where do my articles fit? So that is your assignment for this week, and I'm hoping that it will help you think about the different topics and areas of your topic that you want to cover.